morning, brothers and sisters. It is certainly an honor and a pleasure for me to participate in these historic activities. And as Dr. Wheeler has said in introducing her presentation, Hotep. Hotep is a greeting you'll often hear us use in America. It refers to the ancient African language of the Nile, Medu Neter. It means peace. When someone greets you with Hotep, your response is Hotep. Hotep, brothers and sisters. Hotep. It is indeed a historical gathering that these organizations have been able to promote for us these 2 weeks. We really want to thank NCBS for having the courage and its leadership in bringing our leaders of Black Studies to the continent. We want to thank those people in the Du Bois Institute and the University System of Ghana, and particularly those in the National Commission on Culture for bringing us together. We have watched this building go up over the last few years, people working on it 24 hours a day. And it's fitting that we've had the opportunity to convene here. Last year, we had the opportunity to have a Pan-African forum and seminar and workshop, and it was at another building of substance here in Accra, the International Center, that Ambassador Beho headed at that time. And again, it was historic because Africans from America came to commune with their brothers and sisters here and present their ideas. So Ghana has become, again, a very serious part of the African world and a vanguard in Pan-African formation and Pan-African operation. The imperatives that we have in dealing with Pan-Africanism and preparing for the 21st century are very real, and has been outlined by the previous speakers. We've got to be able to understand the significance of this doctrine and ideology and begin to maximize its potential by making Pan-Africanism operational. We have to operationalize Pan-Africanism. We will continue to have the forums and the conferences and the seminars, but unless we can operationalize what we mean by Pan-Africanism, it will not have the impact that it has to have if Africans into the 21st century are going to be able to control their destinies. In order for us to understand the full significance of operationalizing and systematizing Pan-Africanism, I'd like you to, with me, put into context a framework of analysis which will allow me to move through history in providing my presentation and then project a meaningful future for us. It will be most difficult if we just listen to a series of dates and events and historical happenings and to try to make as much sense out of it as possible. Because of the difficulty of taking so much history and putting it in a context to make real sense, I have formed a process which I call pyramid analysis. This pyramid analysis allows us to look at things in a multi-dimensional way and to see various elements as they interact. It allows me also to predict what I refer to as a systems analysis of historical events and activities in order to be able to interrelate them. So if we really want to appreciate fully the significance of Pan-Africanism, we need to have what I call a systems analysis. Otherwise, we're not able to interrelate these different activities and different historical events, and we develop what I call a paralysis of analysis. In other words, we focus in on one event, one individual, one view of things, and we obscure the other important endeavors that have to be interrelated. Pyramid analysis allows us to interrelate various dimensions at the same time. For example, if we take the image in your mind that I want to create, we take the triangle side of the pyramid. It allows you to deal at the base with the concept of polarities and dualities. If we want to look at life and want to analyze it, if we want to look at Pan-Africanism and analyze it, we need to have fully understanding of this concept of polarity, duality. In life, there are basic polarities. For example, if we talk about the human experience, we have at one polarity the female and at the other polarity the male. The interrelationship between the male and the female produces the child. So you have a dynamic relationship of human development within the context of the pyramid framework. The basic polarity, the formation, I refer to as the thesis. At the opposite pole is the antithesis or antithesis. The interrelationship between those two polarities is the synthesis. In order for us to understand our historical imperative and what we have to do in terms of a Pan-African frame of reference, we have to become synthesizers of our history and understanding of our political development. At the same time, we have to deal with this concept of polarity, duality, to understand that there is an existing reality. And that existing reality has a bipolar approach in that there is an African-Asian world that has been and existed over the millennia. And there has emerged a European-American world. And between these two polarities of the African-Asian world and the European-American world, we have to forge an analysis to understand the synthesis that we have to arrive at, which we call Pan-Africanism. When you use the pyramid frame of reference, you will also be able to interrelate the three dynamic elements that are necessary for us to see what operationalizing Pan-Africanism might mean. First principle in a systems analysis would be to look at these activities that we're referencing in terms of economics. Economics is a first principle and a first polarity that we have to have in mind if we're going to talk about any type of development, because as far as we're concerned in talking about Africanizing Pan-Africanism, we're talking about the development of a systems capability of African peoples for sustained self-development. And when we talk about that operation, we have to see first and foremost the economic principle as key and crucial to anything we do. We can't separate out the economic principle and say it's something that white folks do with their market economy, or it's something that capitalists do as they accumulate capital to make a profit. Economics is the most important systems understanding that one has to have. Economics is the productive and creative capability of the human family. And Africans have to understand fully that their production and their creativity has to be used for African development and African sustenance. Within the context of the existing world system dominated by the European American, our economics, our creativity is used to sustain the European world system. So the economic principle has to be fully understood when we talk about operationalizing Pan-Africanism. Economics is, as I said, that productive capability. And it interrelates with the other polarity that is essential for these twin pillars of Pan-Africanism, and that's the political capability. Politics interrelates with economics. If economics is the productive capability of a system, then politics is the management capability. Politics is not something that President Rawlings does or President Bush or Clinton does. Politics is what people do to control their most essential principle, which is their economics. Politics determines what happens with your productivity. It determines what happens with your creativity. It determines the distribution of the wealth that you produce. So politics is not something that you leave to politicians. Politics is something everybody has to be engaged in. And Africans have to understand, until we develop a Pan-African politic, we cannot think in terms of realizing and operationalizing Pan-Africanism. So the economic principle has to be juxtaposed with the political principle of politics. Your economics relates to your ecology, like your politics relates to your sociology. Economics is determined by the ecology that you're in. So we need these enormous studies of the ecology of the African world. We have to fully understand that. You cannot develop your productive capability if your economic analysis is based upon standards and values that the European has developed for the European ecology. Reference, for example, the Eskimos. The Eskimos have an ecology of ice. They've learned to master it. They cut a hole in the ice and they get down and try to get some fish. But Eskimos do not try to grow corn, manioc. They do not try to grow bananas. The ecology does not allow it. The ecology of the southern nations, where the concentration of African and Asian peoples are, has to be fully understood and studied for its development, not for the subsidiary development of Europe. So there has to be a whole new approach in looking at Pan-Africanism in terms of an economic capability. And in terms of the distribution of wealth, we have to devise our own politics to distribute our wealth, because the distribution of wealth coming from the ideologies we have adopted has not been a distribution place in economics that relates to Africans, and a politics that is directed by this Pan-African approach. Then we have to have the third factor in place to make it sustain itself. And that third factor is culture. Economics relates to politics, and politics and economics relate to culture. Culture is the psychological dimension that provides the cement to sustain your economics and your politics. Culture is the transmission of values that allow you to perpetuate your self-development over generations and periods of time. So when we as Africans get caught up in a paralysis of analysis and we say some of us are cultural nationalists, and some of us are ideological political nationalists, and some of us are development nationalists, we miss the point. We need to have the development nationalists, the ideology nationalists, and the cultural nationalists in sync and coordination with each other in order to have a system capability to do what the African world has to do. But if you have a paralysis of analysis that says only a socialist development will allow you to distribute goods fairly, or a paralysis analysis that says only a capitalist development will allow you to accumulate capital, then you are caught up in a paralysis of analysis that will not allow you to interrelate these three elements that I say are a must in the African world. Culture is key and crucial, because culture determines how you view the world. Culture determines how you develop a sense of mission, purpose, and direction. Culture determines what values you use to structure what you are going to do. Culture refers to the mind. And unless the African mind is liberated, there will be no Pan-Africanism that will be meaningful. If W.E.B. Du Bois, whose remains are enshrined here in Ghana, because it has become the Pan-African beacon for the world, if W.E.B. Du Bois could say at the beginning of the 20th century that the problem of the 20th century was the color line and would be the color line, then those of us who are dealing with these things in a serious way are trying to say to the world that the problem of the 21st century is the African mind. Whomever controls the African mind will be able to sustain their systems development into the 21st century and beyond. So everything is being devised to control the African mind, and we have to be aware of that. Ghana is at a crucial point of its history in which it is about to make a breakthrough in terms of Pan-African direction, but at the same time, in dealing with polarities, there is a world system that is sucking Ghana into the abyss of the European world and imposing upon Ghana that which the European mind has conceived. It is wonderful to travel up to Kumasi and travel out to Cape Coast and Takoradi and see a TV in the hotel room, because it is a means of rapid world communication. But it is a horror for myself and my wife and others to go into the hotel room, turn on the TV, and see the garbage that is spewed out of American TV, poisoning the minds of our people. So if we're going to operationalize Pan-Africanism, then control of the mind becomes crucial. Control of the imaging, control of the value transmission is essential. And that's why this enormous attack has been waged upon us, and I am a symbol of that attack. There's nothing we have done to cause the reaction that has occurred in America around what we are doing, calling for changing the curriculum, putting the truth in the curriculum. But this enormous attack has been waged because we are calling for the liberation of the African mind. And that is what real liberation will be for us. You can have a liberated South Africa led by Nelson Mandela, but if the African mind in South Africa is not freed from those centuries of institutionalized racism, those centuries of Bantu education, those centuries of a chosen people concept coming out of the Afrikaners, if that is not destroyed, then nothing will happen in South Africa that will be meaningful except for continuation of the super exploitation of African peoples with Africans in the front. The liberation of the African mind. And that's why this coming together is so crucial and important. So as we see this connection between economics, politics, and culture, and we link them together, we have to have, again, a polarity in understanding. We have to see external dimensions of that linkage. We have to look at economics in terms of macro analysis, our relationship to world systems and the use of resources around the world. So as we prepare for the 21st century, we have to say these resources that are crucial to the development of the world have to be controlled by Africans. We can't give our gold mines and our diamond mines over to the same people who control the gold and diamonds in South Africa. We can't give our bauxite, our titanium, our uranium over to the same people who control it throughout the world. We have to have a different approach to how we use these vital resources. As we look at macroeconomics, how we relate to the larger world system, we have to look at microeconomics, how we relate the development of economics down to the African village. So at the same time, we're looking at the larger picture. At the same time, we have to deal with the most intimate internal dimensions. And the same would be true of our politics. You have to have a micro-analysis that deals with interrelationship on a political scale. So we have to develop not only economies of scale in integrating our economics, like our brother Dr. Diop said in his book, Black Africa, but we have to have economies of scale in looking at our politics. We need regional African political entities. As Dr. Clark says, we traditionally have had a territorial state, not the nation state. The nation state is centered around too small an entity to have the political capability of delivering. You need the territorial state. You need a territorial state in West Africa, linked up to a territorial state in East Africa, linked up to a territorial state in Central Africa, linked up to a territorial state in Southern Africa. But today we're dealing with the remnants of the European imposed system. We're dealing with the remnants of a post-colonial British system here in Ghana and Nigeria and Sierra Leone. We're dealing with the remnants of a post-colonial system in Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, in Senegal, in Cameroon. We're dealing with a post-colonial system in Mozambique, in Angola. We still have not structured our political entities to relate to the African macro politics that we have to have. A regional Africa that is linked up to a continental Africa that becomes the base for a world African union that links the African in Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool and London with the African in New York and Washington and in California, with the African in the Caribbean and with the African throughout Latin America, particularly Brazil. This is the framework that we're talking about, linking these macro political entities as we develop an African Real Union, but at the same time with this duality, polarity, we have to go internal. And the basic unit for this macro analysis is the African family. Not the African family from the European perspective, the nuclear family that we have been developing and sustaining, but the African family, the extended African family, the concept of the African clan, the concept where the value system was developed and sustained and maintained and became the core of African development throughout the continent, even in those large systems in the Nile as well as in the smaller systems among people like the Dogon. The value system developed out of the African family was the value system centered around the 3 C's, in which the African looked at his world and related to it in terms of a communal, cooperative, and collective perspective. That all Africans within the context of this extended family were seen as spiritually related. that all Africans within the context of this communal family cooperated and worked together, that all Africans shared collectively in the productivity. The concept of the 3 C's is the foundation for an African value system for the 21st century. Opposed to it is the concept of the 3 D's that emerges out of the European experience. The 3 D's being domination, destruction, and death. And as we look at this contrast between the 3 C's, communal, cooperative, and collective spiritual development of African peoples, as contrast to European development emerging out of the ice of Europe, centered around the 3 D's, domination, destruction, and death, we have to see this bipolar relationship around the concept of African humanism, that there's a spiritual relationship to all things in the universe, as opposed to European materialism, which is the objectification of all things, including the human spirit itself, including God. The contrast between African humanism and European materialism has to be seen and understood. Too many of our people are talking Pan-Africanism, talking development, and moving right headlong into European objectification and materialism. That the standard of someone's achievement is whether he has a Mercedes-Benz and a BMW, when in reality, we need an African BMW standard. And that African BMW standard that my wife has been telling me about in the last week or so is not a car made in Europe, but the African BMW is a black man working with other black men, with other black women and families. We need an African BMW to move us around. Forget about the status of the European BMW. Now, until we can link our economics, politics, and culture in a dynamic relationship to see the macro process and to see the micro process, we are in trouble. The same thing would be true of culture. One of the reasons why they're coming down on us so hard is because we called into question the images projected in the TV in Hollywood. They tried to create a paralysis analysis by saying we were focusing on certain people, but it wasn't a question of who we were focusing on. It is what those people controlling Hollywood had done to the image of Africans and Africans in Africa. That out of Africa came life, out of Africa came culture, out of Africa came science, morality, ethics, out of Africa came civilization. And what Hollywood has projected for the world is the Tarzan image. A negativity of African men who have been the standard of manhood in the world. And until we change that, we cannot begin to do these other things, because that value system is too expansive, it is too eternal. We have to attack it in a systematic way to make Pan-Africanism operational. Because it's affecting your children. It's affecting mine in the most insidious ways. So we need to look at politics, economics, politics, and culture in the intimate relationship, but we need to understand that unless Africans can appreciate not just moving into the 21st century with a BMW, a black man working, but that we have to move into the 21st century with our traditional values and cultures. That we have to move into the 21st century, not discarding that which our ancestors left for us. We have to evaluate it and analyze it and use it for the 21st century, not discard it, which is what the European mind has imposed upon us. In order to be something, you have to discard Africa. In order to go to school as a youngster, you have to discard your name, Amma, and take the name Agnes. You have to discard your name, Kojo, and take the name John. This was the imposition of the European colonial mind on our people, that in order to get an education, you had to discard Africa. And the same is true in the question of God and the reverence of your ancestors. It is the ultimate tragedy to walk through Ghana and drive through Ghana and see a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus at every corner. And the historical analysis of Jesus would put him in with African Asian peoples, and he would be African and black. But I'm greeted at the airport with a larger-than-life sign of a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus. There's something wrong with that in this day and age. If that's what is being developed out of Ghana's Pan-Africanism, we're in trouble. If you do not have an image of God that looks like you, then you will not be able to sustain yourself. We have to operationalize Pan-Africanism. And just let me give you this historical analysis, and then I'll fade into the wind. The European was able to produce a world system, and we need to understand the significance of that world system. We need to analyze it. We need to have study groups on it. Moving into black studies internationalizes you, universalizes you. It doesn't push you to a corner of the universe. It allows you to see things in larger dimensions. The European emerged in the 1400s from a period of abject chaos, disintegration. Europe can be described in those few hundred years before the 1400s as land poor, resource poor, people poor. European systems had decayed. The Catholic Church controlled the European mind. It could not think creatively. European economics was straddled by a slavery called feudalism. Europeans had imposed upon their human development slavery. White slave trade for 1,000 years precedes the African enslavement. We have to understand what Europe was. The destruction of the European concept of human development was so real that women were considered a pariah within the context of European values, and women were burned at the stake. So when we see the example of Joan of Arc, we need to see it as endemic to European society, that women by the hundreds of thousands were burned because they were considered witches, which in the context of the European mind, in the context of the African mind, the woman, the mother, is goddess, is God, is queen mother, is chief priestess. There's a different context that we developed our values in relationship to the human family. We need to understand what we accepted and what was imposed upon us. 82 becomes an important date, and I have what I call in my historical analysis the 50-year turning point of history, which will allow you to feel and understand the European system and how it was put in place, and how Europe could move from land poor, resource poor, people poor, and within a period of a short time, a few hundred years, move to become land rich, people rich, and resource rich in unbelievable dimension. 1482 becomes important. As Professor Wheeler said, in the 1400s, the European was beginning to put together his system capability. And leading that process was the Catholic Church. Because of the conflict between the East and the West, because of the conflict between Islam and Christianity, because of the conflict between the African Moors who dominated Spain, the Pope decreed in the 1400s that Catholics had the right to enslave Africans who were inferior, infidel peoples. So the basis for the slave system is laid at the door of the Catholic Church, which provides the rationale. And as Europe was trying to get out of its icebox and move around Africa to get to Asia, and eventually sail across the ocean to get to Asia through passing through the so-called New World, we have to understand the significance of these buildings in Ghana, these monuments to man's inhumanity to man. These are not just slave forts and dungeons. These are not just historical sites. These are the keys to open up an analysis of what the world has become because of the European in relationship to the African. We can't treat these things superficially. We can't have some restaurants and some Disneylands and some hotels where people will be dragged around to gawk and look at these things. We need an analysis of what they represent as keys to open up what Europe became. 1482. The Portuguese sailing down the coast after many years decide to establish a permanent base at Elmina. And Elmina of St. George refers to the mine. They were interested in gold. Europe had a problem because it was land poor, resource poor, and people poor. It did not have the riches of other parts of the world. So they came first looking for the gold. But 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue and discovers the so-called new land. Even though there were tens of millions of people there, he discovered it. Even though there were ancient civilizations there, he discovered it. Columbus was lost, didn't discover a thing, crossed the ocean 4 times, never knew where the hell he was. But we still say Columbus discovered something. But 1492 is important because it again represents this analysis that I'm saying you've got to have. We are told to take an event, Columbus, and then stick it in our minds and then worship it as a European achievement. But before you deal with 1492 Columbus, you have to deal with 1492 January, the fall of Granada in Spain, when the last Muslim stronghold fell to the Catholics, and Ferdinand and Isabel were able to put together a system capability of a nation state called Spain. And that becomes the basis for the modeling of European nation states after that. 1492 January has to be clocked in with 1492 October. 1492 March has to be clocked into with 1492 January, because that's when the Jews were expelled from Spain. So again, the ripping off of people's wealth in order to build your own system capability becomes institutionalized for the European. And this ripping off of people's wealth is happening today. Mouths are salivating over the possibility of Ghana's gold and diamonds and other possibilities in Europe now. The same process went on earlier where people salivated over the wealth of the Moors and the Jews in Spain. So before we analyze 1492, Columbus sailing the ocean blue, we need to understand Granada and the struggle that went on for hundreds of years with the African Arab Moors. And we need to understand the relationship of the Jews in relationship to Islam and Christianity. You need an analysis. Europe comes into the picture, land poor, resource poor, people poor. It cannot consider itself the first world. At that juncture of history, Europe was maybe the fifth or sixth world. It certainly wasn't comparable to the Islamic world. It was not comparable to the Asian world. Europe was not comparable to the African world. The great nation, empire states of Ghana, Mali, and Sangay, the successor states, the city-states of the Swahili. Europe had no comparable development. Its systems had decayed. 1482 has to be related to 1492. And after 1492, the so-called discovery of the New World, you had 1494. Columbus comes back again. But before coming back, there is a conflict between Spain and Portugal, and the Pope decides in Rome to divide up the world between these two insignificant Catholic nations with a papal bull cemented by the Treaty of Tordesillas. The world is divided, North and South Pole, one side of it given to Spain, the other side of it given to Portugal. This is unbelievable. But this is how the European system capability is put in place in this period of time. 1496, Columbus comes back. First time he came with syphilis and other European diseases. This time he comes with sugarcane, which becomes a major disease of the African world. And labor needs are imposed upon the New World. First they try to use European labor, which proved itself successful under feudalism. It failed in America. Then they tried to use the Native Americans, and they were dying out from European disease and oppression. Then the Catholic Church, symbolized by Bartolomé de las Casas, 1510, is pleading with the church in Rome. Native Americans are being destroyed, and he wrote books on the history of the Indies detailing the millions of Native Americans destroyed. And he said, to save the Native American souls for the Catholic Church's heaven, bring over Africans who have no souls to save. And the systematic taking of Africans out of Africa to the Spanish New World is supported by the Spanish throne and the Church in Rome. 1517, an important date to clock in with the rest of these. 1517 is the birth of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. An insignificant date, or usually you think of it as religious date, but we need to think of it in terms of economics, politics, and culture. It is at that point that the European develops the beginnings of a new political, economic, and cultural dimension of his life that has led to the domination of the world by the European today. It is the Protestant Reformation that frees the European mind from the Catholic Church's controls and shackles. It is the Protestant Reformation that allows the European to develop an economy which he called capitalist and now free market. It has allowed the European to develop a concept of nation state around his ethnicity and not around the religious control of the Catholic Church. It is the European Protestant Reformation that allows them to develop a concept of culture centered around individualism and not the collectivism of the Catholic Church. But in the European context, that individualism becomes an enormity for us because it creates the concept of certain people elected by God to rule over other peoples. The concept of the elect of God, the predetermination of others to rule over others, comes out of this Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is born at the same time that the Europeans are institutionalizing slavery. Don't forget that. Economics, politics, and culture. This institutionalization of slavery of Africans and the emergence of the Protestant Reformation gives us an understanding of how and why the European developed the concept of the nation state. Link Luther with 1532 Calvin. Calvin in Geneva comes up with the concept of a theocratic state that has a foundation of economics, politics, and culture. And that theocratic state becomes the model for the European nationalism down the road. And so you use this liberation of the European mind by the Protestant Reformation with the development of European nationalism and the state. 1519, Cortez destroys the Aztec Empire. 1531-32, Pizarro destroys the Incas. And what does that do? Give the Europeans more gold, more silver, to go with the gold and silver and diamonds coming from Africa. So the European now is poised to make his concept of nationalism, colonialism, imperialism, racism, classism dominant in the world. And for the next 500 years, he institutionalizes this system. The prototype of this European modern state with the capabilities of dominating becomes England, 1536. Henry VIII breaks with the Catholic Church, liberates the English mind so that they can build the model nation state, linking economics, politics, and culture for the development of the Europeans. And the English take control of the slave system from the Catholics, Spain and Portugal. They fight the Dutch, and they become the dominant slavers, using slavery, the genocide of African peoples, to create the economic capital to become the first industrial capitalist nation. You've got to link these monuments to man and humanity, to man, Elmina, Cape Coast, Osu, Oxim, Dix Cove, Comenda. You have to link them to Liverpool, Bristol, to London, to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, to Hamburg, to Lisbon, and to the various ports in America. And until we do that, we won't have the systems analysis of understanding what happened. How could the Europeans in the period before be land poor, resource poor, people poor, and all of a sudden emerge to dominate the world around the European-American nationalism? But their system did manifest itself. It has dominated the world. We have been super exploited in the genocidal process. But every system has a beginning, has a development, has a maturity, and has a decline. The European system is in decline. We have to begin to see it and understand it. As I wind down, I just want to leave you with this, that if the European world system emerged 1482 to 1536, and they helped to produce a turning point of world history in which they developed their control and domination of the world. After 1941, with Pearl Harbor, after 1945, the world has been moving into a 50-year turning point of African-Asian history. We are preparing ourselves for control of the 21st century and beyond. Events have happened to us, but we're in the middle of it, so we're in the eye of the storm. We cannot see that. But after World War II, the European system collapsed, and they've been trying to put it together ever since. Now they call it a New World Order, then they call it the Atlantic Charter, but everything has been done to paste the European system back together again, and it is falling apart, and there's no saving it. The question is, what does that mean for Africans? That means you have to understand our historical dimension, that the struggles against the European system are now becoming real and meaningful, that the struggle in 1946 led to the independence of India or Indonesia, led to, in 1947, to the independence of India, in 1948-49, to the independence of China. It led to the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, where people like Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta and Padma and W.B. Du Bois mapped out an African future. It led in the 50s to the development of Gamal Nasser and Naguib, who brought African peoples to the head of Egypt for the first time in 1,000 years. It led to the Sudan's independence. It led in 54, 55 into the Mau Maus. It led to the Bandung Conference. It led to the sit-ins and to the marches that we had in America. It led to the independence of the Caribbean. It eventually led to 50 African nations becoming independent after Ghana 57 and after Guinea 58. It led into the 60s, where the Portuguese Empire was collapsed in on itself, and it led to the independence of Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Angola. And in the 80s, it is leading to further African independence on into the 90s. You have to understand that we are part of a historical turning point of history, that the ingredients, the capabilities for the African world system are being put in place now. We have to see the larger picture. But we can lose it. We can lose it if we lose control of the African mind. That's our imperative. Liberate the African mind and put Africans, along with Asians, back in place as first world peoples. Thank you very much.